Okay, I want to thank everybody for inviting me to this symposium, especially Lynn and all the organizing crew at RMS. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've been a professor for about 36 and a half years. I've retired about 4 years and still trying to figure out this retirement thing. I'm not doing very well. Got too many things going on. I want to give some credit. Also, my co-authors on the book, which almost has the same title as my presentation, is April Baptiste from Colgate University, and Sharon Moran is also professor at SUNY ESF in Syracuse, New York. And I want to say for the group that I do a lot of kayaking in central New York, so I get out on the water whenever I can, as soon as the water warms up. So we're in the same venue as you all. Started out doing a lot of work on this in 2008, 2009. I had a sabbatical and I finished one book and started another. In order to start this work, I traveled throughout the United States from California, Milwaukee, Chattanooga, Tennessee, New York City, all over the place, looking at river restoration work that local communities have been doing. So that's sort of the background for this whole thing. So we're going to look at sort of the environmental justice issues, as well as some processes that we can do to try to move forward on new ways of doing things. So first of all, a little bit of introduction. I don't know if a lot of you have been on urban waterways, but we have a sad history of neglect of a lot of our urban waterways. Pollution, flooding, channelization, all through history, we've been basically neglecting our urban waterways. And so now we're just beginning to get back into the habit of trying to restore or revitalize some of these. And we're dealing with a really diverse populations in multiple jurisdictions in a lot of cases. So that makes the work a little bit more complicated and a little bit harder to do. Also, we have a lot of information on physical waterway restoration, revitalization, but we don't have so much information on social process. How do we get people to be involved in the process, and how do we go about it? Also, there's a difference between restoration versus revitalization and naturalization. Usually when we think of stream restoration, we think of putting the ecology back or dealing with the water quality issues. Versus revitalization, we may be talking about more than the physical aspect. We may be talking about social and economic as well as physical. And then naturalization is basically, we're saying we're going to green it up a little bit. We're not going to go all the way to restoration, but we're doing some greening. So a lot of the work is involved in terms of this book and social process research and guidance. So let's get moving. So as I said before, urban stream are sometimes written off. We're dealing with some historical and cumulative environmental justice issues. People have been forced to live along floodplains or along combined overflows in urban areas. So they've been really subject to a long period of time, what we call sort of cumulative environmental justice issues. So I'll be talking about some cases that have had these cumulative environmental justice issues. In many cases, we've got jurisdictions and organizations that have political issues or economic issues, and they become barriers in terms of trying to move forward. A good example is combined overflows in many urban areas. In our eastern and midwestern cities, we have, a long time had combined overflows, so that whenever you have a storm, stormwater goes directly into receiving water body. And trying to deal with these issues that have a long historical timeline is become very difficult. In many cases, we have communities that suffered environmental justice issue over a long period of time. So maybe some of the opportunity here is to partially offset some of this cumulative environmental damage that has been done. And the other piece of this is we need to help communities find a voice. How do they become involved in the process? What are the ways that they can become involved in terms of becoming part of the process for revitalization? So US EPA has a definition for environmental justice. This is sort of the institutional definition. Fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all peoples regardless of race, color, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. But this really came from a lot of the toxic waste sites like Love Canal, places like this. So we have this historical sort of institutional definition, but it really goes beyond this. We looked at a lot of the aspects that we're looking at. So if you look at environmental justice theory, there are some scholars that have been working on this, but it basically works out to be who makes decisions, who pays, and who benefits. So we have procedural environmental justice, which is how do people become involved, or how do they have access to become involved? And distributive environmental justice, which is, okay, who benefits or who suffers the cost? So these are the two major groups of theory pieces that make up environmental justice theory. It gets more involved, but for our purposes, I think this works for us. And the other thing is political ecology, looking at who is linked to whom in terms of causing stuff to happen or not to happen. And also look at the complexity of the social economic dynamics over time when we have changes in administration or politics, whether we have a Republican dominated legislative system or democratic system or a mixed system, how do things happen or not happen? And we need to explore ways that political, economic, and ecological processes work together. And we'll see a little bit of an example of this as we move forward. So I want to profile 5 case studies, which look at leadership, look at the neighborhood demographics, who initiated the revitalization process, what strategies did they use, and what are some outcomes. So I'll go through 5 of these really quick case studies and discuss each of them a little bit using these 5 criteria. So the first one is pretty close to you folks in Richmond, I guess. And then in Anacostia River, and next to the Potomac and Washington, D.C. area, it really kind of a really split. If you look at the community, the southeastern part of it is heavily Black and lower income, and the northeastern part is white and more wealthy. So you have a real split in the demographics in the community. The leadership was provided by the Anacostia Watershed Partnership and Groundwork DC. These are the 2 not-for-profits that have been heavily involved in the revitalization work in the Anacostia. So you have joint involvement of government, environmental organizations, and private citizens. And the reasons for this is trying to reestablish the river ecosystem health, help community development, and provide recreational access. There's a long history of fishing in the Anacostia and the Potomac by lower income groups. So they really want to be able to reestablish the fishing and water access for the community. So the major means were a water quality lawsuit, in this case against the US Navy for heavy pollution in the area. And there was a heavy media campaign involved with this whole thing. And the outcomes are some water quality improvement. They didn't clean everything up. They have still issue with combined sewer flows in the area. And there is some community displacement as well. So if you look at the whole watershed, from the rural areas to the north, heading to the south, the more developed areas, and it's a pretty expansive watershed in terms of the whole Anacostia. But as you get closer to the Potomac, then you get more urbanization and more things like combined overflows and other kinds of pollution sources. And of course, you had JFK Stadium on the Anacostia River. So the thinking was that this would be a major economic generator for the area. But a lot of the local community was more concerned with how do we improve the neighborhood? How do we create jobs? How do we increase our amenities for our local folks living in these neighborhood areas? So there was kind of a tension between economic development and neighborhood benefits. Now, one of my favorite cases is the Bronx River in New York City. I did spend some time here looking at this situation. This is, if anybody's ever been to the Bronx, the South Bronx, this is a very poor neighborhood in the whole metro New York City area. 24%, 4% Black and Hispanic. Very difficult from the economic point of view. The leadership is provided by the Bronx River Alliance and the Bronx River Working Group. And the Bronx River Alliance is really an umbrella group that creates lots and lots of different NGOs and other organizations. So they started, community activists really started. You may know of Majora Carter. who established Sustainable South Bronx. And lots of other organizations and actors were involved, including public agencies. The New York City Park Agency was heavily involved in this whole effort. So they wanted ecological river restoration. They wanted community access. They wanted green space benefits. And this was really a collaborative civil society and government organization. Eventually, they started with confrontational tactics, but really coalesced, and they raised a huge amount of money from city and state sources. And the outcomes are a gain in riverfront green space and public awareness of the benefits of that whole South Bronx River area. So if you look, there's a sort of a map of the area. There's now a lot of parks along here where there was not previously. And there's a whole greenway established along the South Bronx as well. In fact, there's an old cement works that has been turned into a public park. And one of the major events they have each year is they have what they call the Golden Globe Festival. And see the little golden globe in the first canoe, right between the two people? They go down the river every year, starting from the Bronx Zoo, coming down the Bronx River, and this canoe flotilla. And then they also have people walk along the edge as well. And you can see to the upper left, you see those red towers. That's the cement plant that has been turned into a public park. So a huge amount of work in terms of, building awareness and in terms of community effort, in terms of this whole area. Super effort. Now, a different kind of case in Chattanooga. Usually we think of Chattanooga, Tennessee, we think of a lot of the stuff that's going on in the Tennessee River. Well, there's a little creek called Chattanooga Creek, which drains into the Tennessee River in Chattanooga, and that's had a major pollution problem. So the demographics, again, we have a real split between Alton Park, which is heavily Black and 58% heavy poverty rates, and Pinewood, which is mostly white and only 26% poverty. So again, you have this kind of split community. And the leadership was an NGO called Stop Toxic Pollution and the Alton Development Corporation. So the NGO, Stop Toxic Pollution, pushed this as a major environmental justice case and went to EPA, said we've got some water quality pollution issues as well as toxic issues. So there was industrial water quality pollution, and the site was also on the national priority list for toxic sites. A lot of public hearings through the US EPA, through that whole process. They did a community charrette to talk about what they wanted the community to be, even given if they could clean up the toxics. And the outcomes are some improvement in health services, education, housing, job training, but some abandoned properties in the process because they probably had to close down some industries as part of the whole toxic cleanup. So it's kind of a mixed issue. This is more of a classic, I call environmental justice case that stems from pollution issue. So the creek is actually located, you see the arrow here, where it drains into the Tennessee River, right on the edge of the city of Chattanooga, with some heavy topography, very steep hills rising either side of the Tennessee River where it comes into the river. And this is one of the fellows who was testing the water quality here. This was in a newspaper story about the Chattanooga Creek toxic pollution. Okay, now near and dear to my heart, Onondaga Creek in Syracuse, where I was involved from 2005 to 2008 as the facilitator for the Onondaga Creek Revitalization Plan. So this is an interesting case in terms of the demographics because we have rural areas to the south and the watershed. The watershed actually drains from south to north into Onondaga Lake. And the rural areas are suburban to rural to farm areas. And then the creek actually drains through the Onondaga Nation, an original indigenous community right in the middle of the watershed. And then it drains to Nedrow into the city of Syracuse, where it's really poor folks living alongside the floodplain or other mixed areas. So we have a leadership issue is interesting because the Onondaga Nation has wanted the creek cleaned up because the white Europeans came and ruined everything, the lake and the creek with pollution. The United States Legal Foundation was a private non-NGO who started a suit against a major polluter and the county for water quality to clean up the lake. So we've got federal, state, local government, NGOs, and Onondaga Nation involved in the situation. So the lake was being cleaned up. It's still being cleaned up starting in about 1990. Senator Monahan finally got some money to create a lake management corporation, and the lake has been steadily cleaned up, both from industrial sources and from domestic sewage issues and combined sewer overflows. But a bunch of us got together in 2004, said, well, you're cleaning up the lake, but you should clean up the creek as well. There are other issues involved in the creek, which drains into the lake. So we did a proposal which got funded, and that was the revitalization effort from 2005 to 2008. So water quality compliance is a major issue. We justified the revitalization from the point of view of improving water quality. We're dealing with CSOs, combined overflows, agricultural drainage, sediment from some natural occurring things upstream. So the lawsuit was one of the major means, right, in terms of forcing the issue. But then we had to come up with a compliance plan, and we then used green infrastructure to reduce stormwater inflows coming into the whole system. And the outcome was a creek revitalization plan stretching through the whole watershed, and then the creek walk within the city running south from Onondaga Lake, which is still under construction, and combined sewer overflow abatement to try to deal with the stormwater not coming in so much into the creek and into the lake. So as part of the revitalization plan, here you see a map of the actual watershed. So the bottom is the south and the top is the north. And you can see how the creek kind of winds around, goes through the Onondaga Nation in the middle, and then through the city of Syracuse to Onondaga Lake as it heads north. So for 2005 to 2008, we established a citizens working group made up of citizen groups from all over the watershed, including the Onondagas. This is the only project in central New York that the Onondaga Nation has been heavily involved in. All other lake cleanup activities they have not been involved in because they don't trust the federal government or the state government. So this is really the exception. But we had to gain community support for the revitalization plan. So this is typical channelized creek. Like in the golden age of channelization, early 1900s to 1950, a lot of the streams in the United States were channelized like this. So the problem is, can we rebuild some of the features of the creek? And it's very difficult in urban areas because there's no place to move because of the development that has occurred. So it's very hard to kind of put it back. Oops. Okay, I'm going to get later on, I'm going to come back to this case study to show some of the techniques we used for actually involving folks in the cleanup. So another example is Mill Creek in Philadelphia. This little bitty creek is actually buried. You cannot see any physical signs of it. It's all underneath the street system. But an academic, Ann Spurn from the University of Pennsylvania, got involved with school kids in the Mill Creek area and developed a landscape literacy project. This is a very black and poor neighborhood in Philadelphia. And the idea that Ann had was to raise awareness about the creek, because the kids obviously had no notion that this thing existed or what was involved with the neighborhood. So they had lots of school projects and community workshops. The outcomes were increased environmental literacy and recognition, but limited local action in terms of opening up the creek or daylighting it or dealing with any of the other issues. But at least it increased the awareness in terms of the creek and how it related to the neighborhood. And here's the map of where it existed in Philadelphia. Obviously, you don't see any wavy blue lines because it's underneath the streets. So looking at these case studies, we can get an idea of the role of citizen advocacy groups plus all the other actors and what roles they play. We can get an idea of what the major historic equity issues were and how the EJ, environmental justice issues, are going to be dealt with or not. The reasons for revitalization pretty heavily were water quality, flooding issues, and social economic issues related to the neighborhoods affected. And the means varied from legal means to cooperative participatory activities. Outcomes are awareness, plans, water quality cleanup, and community social economic benefits. And the last part is probably the most heavily valued by local residents, but probably occurred the least. So there's some challenges with when we look at environmental justice issues. It's really hard to sort of dig up a lot of the information unless there are legal documents and a lot of documentation. There's timing issues with corporate and government negligence. Some things start, some things stop, right? Who's responsible? Were there legal actions? Did anything result? How far did it go? Well, there's a lack of maintenance and enforcement from some of the municipal organizations. And there's changes in project management. So if you have one administration in the city that comes into power and they get elected out and some new administration comes in, you have this discontinuity effect. So sometimes it's hard to really keep things moving over a period of time. And sometimes there's what we call internalized racism, like the Mill Creek issue in Philadelphia. They were called the bottom. They didn't know why they were called the bottom. Is it because of economics? Is it because they buried the stream? So there's this nasty sort of internalized historic linkage with this whole bottom kind of thing that runs throughout. And there's also issues sometimes that we call intergenerational equity. So the most fun part when I was working on the Onondaga Creek project was listening to people's stories. These stories get lost. You know, how do you get these things together and build them into the heritage that's linked to the creek or the stream? And then there's a problem in terms of leadership with the NGOs, right? You have a really active person who provides leadership, and then something happens to that person and somebody else comes in. Is there the continuity of leadership in terms of continuing through? And this is very often happens in many, many situations. Well, what are we going to do? You know, we've got these issues, as I illustrated in the 5 case studies. How can we move forward? And I have a number of issues here, which is in the book. Each is a chapter of the book. Enhanced public engagement, restoring streams and relationships, community engagement and mapping, using green infrastructure, and using creative engagement through the arts. So each of these five areas I'll touch upon just briefly. So in enhanced public engagement, Ann Spurn did this, of course, in developing landscape literacy with the school kids. You know, this is one way to go about it, at least to get people aware that there's some history here, there's something going on here with this urban waterway. Another way that a fellow named Selman in Australia has been dealing with future waterway visioning, getting groups of people together and say, what do you want it to be? We did this with Onondaga Creek in Syracuse. We had major workshops, and we asked, first of all, what do you want to see happen? And then we asked them, what do you think the constraints are? So the thing is to go forward positively, the first step, and say, what do you want to see happen? What's your future visioning? Another academic called UCAN has written about building watershed narratives. You know, what's the story with the watershed or the waterway that you can build a sort of a narrative? It could be a historical narrative, it could be a descriptive narrative. You know, it's like building a database for the values attached to that waterway. And finally, Wessels et al. Has written about place-based conservation. This is done a lot of times for conservation, getting people to relate to the place. It could be done, again, by the narratives, but the idea is place-based conservation or restoration or revitalization to tie it to the place. Okay, also restoring streams and relationships. So we mentioned before, reconstructing the historical context. Often people don't know the history. How can you put this back, recreate the history so at least people know it? We did this for Onondaga Creek. We developed a sort of state of the creek, little publications about fisheries, about flooding, about nature conservation. And we went back and forth between the technical people and the working group or to citizens until everything made sense. Build mechanisms for social learning. Just as they did in the South Bronx, everybody is involved in the process continuously. So you don't just do a report and surface it and then say, here it is. You need to have the folks involved work continuously with the technical people to build social learning all along the process. And also, we may realize in doing this, the objectives may be a lot different between the creek technical people and the neighborhood people. Objectives may be totally different, or aspirations may be totally different. You've got to deal with this up front and deal with this continually through the process. And develop social and cultural sensitive metrics. My cohort, Sharon Moran, talks about this. The need to develop meaningful metrics. How do you tell if you're doing something right? How do you tell if you're making progress? You need the metrics to enable that. Okay, community engagement and mapping. Obviously, if you're doing creek restoration work or waterway work, you need a lot of spatial data, right? So you need physical data, which a lot of people pay attention to usually, but you also need social and psychological perception data. And you do this by talking to a lot of people and doing surveys and other things like that. So you build spatial data that's both physical and psychological and social as well. And so there's some new techniques that are being used, like participatory GIS. So usually the technicians produce the geographic information systems of the maps, right? Computer maps. But you need to have local folks involved with that as well to sort of cross-check a lot of the information, right? So participatory GIS with feedback. There's been a system called agent modeling that has been used in Philadelphia. Participatory design, we have workshops, actually people involved. I'm going to give an example of that shortly. Decision support systems, a lot of the engineers like to use decision support systems, but they need to be understandable by the neighborhoods that they're used in. Drexel University in Pennsylvania has done some outstanding work on green infrastructure work and decision support systems. Crowdsourcing, we can use now with phones and cellular phones and all kinds of things and internet, we can do crowdsourcing to build information databases. And we have some recent examples of that that have been used down in Georgia looking at coastal flooding issues. So lots of tools, new tools that can be used. Now, here's my favorite example. This is part of the Onondaga Creek Revitalization Plan. So what we did was we divided the creek, the whole watershed, the whole length of the creek up into an urban area, sort of a suburban area, also 4 areas, the Onondaga Nation and the rural areas and the upper watersheds. So we developed these huge aerial photos, put an acetate overlay over it, and we had a series of playing cards. The playing cards had specific measures that you could do, like hydrology stuff, ecological stuff, land use stuff, recreational development stuff. So everybody could work on the play cards and put them on top of the map and literally build projects on top of the map. So this was done for the urban areas, it was done for the suburban areas, it was done for the upper watershed areas, and the Onondaga Nation did it. But they used sticky notes. They didn't want to use our cards, but they used sticky notes. That's fine, that works. Shipping the canoe, you know, parallel action. So this is written up in one of our chapters, and it's really in a lot of our papers. And this is what we consider the innovative game-playing charrette design process. And there's the final product. We produced a whole series of maps from this raw stuff of the playing cards and the acetate overlays. So this was in the final plan, was a series of these maps that was in community-generated, produced measures. Okay, greenway infrastructure. A lot of talk about green infrastructure these days, you know, to enhance the riparian habitat, improve water and air quality, maybe store some carbon, plus recreational, aesthetic, and human health benefits. When you do this along an urban waterway, another way to do it, plus the actual physical green infrastructure, no matter what it is to assess the ecosystem services. You're doing the work, you might as well figure out what the benefits are, right? So in the UK and other places, there's increasingly ways of how you calculate ecosystem services. So ecosystem services could be things like clean water, right? Or alleviation of flooding, or they could be cultural, they could be aesthetic, they could be educational, right? So there's a whole system of ecosystem services. So you need to establish a baseline, you know, what's the current situation, identify and provide qualitative assessment and impacts, look at your different options, right, for your green infrastructure, which produces more ecosystem services or different ecosystem services, and then assess the effects on human welfare. And then value the changes that have happened in your ecosystem service generation. So not only do you use green infrastructure, you need to calculate the benefits. And here's an example of the Bronx River where they've done some bank stabilization. There's some that will reduce the amount of sedimentation going into the South Bronx River. So they're doing a lot of this right now. So the last thing is what we call creative engagement. One of my co-authors, Sharon Moran, she really loves this stuff. So we said, okay, we'll do a book chapter on it. So the idea is to bring the creative arts as a way of gaining people's attention. And we have a couple of examples here. We have the San Diego murals in San Diego's Chicano Park, Onondaga Creek, Waterbird graffiti in Los Angeles, and participatory swimming in the Seine River in Paris. So this is the mural by Victor Oja in San Diego. And the idea is that you create artwork that links, even on a highway overpass, linkage to your water feature, which is to the bay, San Diego Bay, right? So this is there, and this is the graphics that are existing today. For Onondaga Creek, we have a professor at Syracuse University that decided it'd be neat to have sort of a sound art project. So as you're walking through the creek, this recorded sounds as you're walking through the environment. You could actually do narration, I suppose, as well, through this sound walkthrough in the Onondaga Creek. Some other art in Los Angeles. Some of these murals are fantastic. You know, you might look at it as graffiti. I look at it as pretty good art, you know, in terms of looking at the linkage between water-based features, you know, drawing attention to the Los Angeles River, basically, trying to make the connection. And what we call this, even though you're not supposed to swim in the Seine River in Paris, these people are swimming, and they're creating a demonstration, basically. Through this sort of recreational activity, they're sort of drawing attention to the river and the connection with people's needs to have more contact with it, right? So it's creative engagement in terms of like a mass art demonstration situation. So throughout this whole thing, we're trying to say that environmental justice issues need to be addressed through inclusion of disenfranchised urban communities. And this exists all over the world. I found examples in Europe and other places in Australia and other places as well. So it's not only the US, it's not only North America, this is all over the place. So there are opportunities for use and being inclusive and collaborative processes to address EJ issues. And maybe actually improve urban greenway and waterway access, improve human health benefits, and as well as improve the ecology of the stream. So this is the whole trick. How do we improve the human health, psychological welfare issues? How do we address previous historic environmental justice issues and kind of bring it all together? And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. But we feel that this can happen if structured well and if the processes work well together. And here's an example that even in Syracuse, we're connecting the lake all the way, the trail now goes all the way south from Onondaga Lake down through the city of Syracuse and extending almost to the next municipality south of the city. So it goes through all kinds of different neighborhoods. Sometimes the environmental conditions are a little bit better than others, but it's moving, it's getting done. So as I said, I owe some tribute to my co-authors, Sharon Moran, April Baptiste from Colgate University, and our book is called Revitalizing Urban Waterway Communities, Streams of Environmental Justice. And it was published in 2018. But we're very hopeful that a lot of folks will take to it. Any questions?
Thank you so much. So I do see a question in the chat asking, what do you think the best way to get what do you think is the best way to get groups involved, or how do you reach out to the first group?
I think you have to have sort of like a mission statement or an objective. Either recognizing a local situation or trying to move forward and say we want to deal with this issue. People have to know what they're involved with. If you get all mushy and vague, people are not going to get involved probably. So it really needs to get anchored somehow, either an existing condition or how you're going to improve the situation somehow.
Thank you. If there's more questions, you can either put them in the chat or you can also ask them by unmuting yourself.
I have one, Dr. Smardon. Who in the Onondaga project, who drove it? What was the core person's small task force who initiated, led it? Was it you?
Well, it was a mix. We had a project team of about 5 different organizations. The Onondaga Environmental Institute, which originally was involved in the lake cleanup work, was the one that wrote the proposal and managed the project.
Mm-hmm.
Also involved was Atlantic States Legal Foundation that started the original suit, a green space group that was involved with greenway development, the city of Syracuse, and ESF, SUNY ESF, Environmental Science and Forestry, with me as a facilitator for the working group. So it was a team approach.
Mm-hmm. The team collectively realized they were working together.
Oh yeah, well it was part of the project design. We wrote it into the proposal. We would do this. And the project manager was actually from Onondaga Environmental Institute, but we had literally weekly meetings and then we had monthly meetings with the citizen working group. So constantly working back and forth between the technical working group and the citizen working group.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
I see another question in the chat that asks, what is the thing that makes revitalizing urban waterways different than other like land use and green space types? Are they fundamentally different?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's so much more complex. As I said, you're dealing with different kinds of populations, rich folks, poor folks, people with different kinds of communities, different jurisdictions. You have to manage the whole thing. So you're dealing with a lot of different roles and players. If you're dealing with a rural stream restoration effort, it's a lot simpler right away.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question, Dr. Smardon, is in terms of the kinds of groups that you've been able to help pay for this kind of work, like who backs it financially to get this kind of planning started?
Yeah, Lynn, it really varies a lot. And for the Onondaga Creek, we were tapping into U.S. Environmental Protection Agency funds because it was part of the Onondaga Lake cleanup. Right, so we wrote a proposal for about, I don't know, $250,000 or something like that spread over 5 years that was funded through federal state funds. And for the Bronx River, the South Bronx, they were able to tap into the city of New York, the Parks Department, and heavily pushed local congressional folks for federal funding. So fundraising is a big thing. The Anacostia, there was a major group that was able to get also funds for the Anacostia planning effort. So it's a variety. So you can run it through the positive fundraising kind of way, or you can have a major legal issue and run it through the negative funding way, right? As a settlement. Yeah.
Thank you.
Where can we buy the book?
Amazon has it.
Okay.
Or you can go directly to Routledge. If you look in the Routledge book page, or you can just when you type in the name in the Google, it's going to pop up.
Okay.
How has the, separate from how many books that you're selling, but has the response been different or similar or different than what you expected? It seems like this book is here at the perfect time. Dr. Smardon.
No, we haven't sold a lot of copies yet. So, it's hard when you publish. I call it publish and perish because I produce a lot of books, but it's really hard to, you're not producing a novel, right? So sales are tricky and difficult, and getting the word out is, that's why it's nice to have this talk, because it kind of gets the word out. But also, I think a lot of people with COVID and all right now, people have a lot of other things on their minds, right? So this may have stalled some efforts in some places in some ways.
So maybe it's perfect for this time among a narrow audience, among those who, for whom get it and appreciate your perspective on history and your sense of the process and something that's really complicated.
Thank you.
Really great stuff.
So. Anything else I can help with?
Maybe people are tired from a full week of looking at their computers.
Maybe. I'm planning a conference right now, as Lynn knows, for October. So we're learning from you.
I'm finding this a lot to think about. I'm having to process it.
It was interesting to listen to your presentation, that included the Anacostia, because we had the talk on it 2 days ago or yesterday, I guess. But it seems like a lot longer ago than that. And, they were all involved in it, and they talked a lot about sort of the people, but your perspective of sort of the process was really, I think, good.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what we do the research on these cases, right? To figure out, who did what to whom.
Yeah.
My favorite time was when I was traveling all over the states, working on during my sabbatic. I was in Oakland, California, and then Milwaukee, and then Denver and Chattanooga, talking to local people. It's like investigative reporting. Who did what to whom?
Right.
Well, thank you again. Big round of applause. That was awesome.